Welcome to Comics Bazaar, the channel of comics commentary and arcana. This video features the Uncanny X-Men number 279, cover dated August 1991. And this is Chris Claremont's last issue of the Uncanny X-Men, his original run, which lasted 16 years, all the way from Uncanny X-Men number 94 to this particular issue, and he quit midway through. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the issue itself. Just to notice here, the cover is by guest penciler and guest inker Andy Kubert and Scott Williams. A pretty striking cover, pretty dramatic, and very much in line with Kubert's style from when he ultimately would take over from Jim Lee on Adjectiveless X-Men in 1992. So this cover picks up from the end of the previous issue. Colossus here with his metallic skin colored with a gold hue, indicating he's possessed by the Shadow-King. So why is he trying to kill Professor X? Because he's possessed by the Shadow-King. We've got Stevie Hunter here intervening. So let's open this one up. So our half splash here features Colossus emerging from the wreckage of Stevie Hunter's burning vehicle. And of course here we see that the Shadow-King has possessed him. And the Shadow-King says, "Your X-Man is mine now, to Professor X, slave, body and soul to the will of the Shadow-King. His orders are to rend the lovely Miss Hunter limb from limb. I did warn you, my dear, of the terrible price of defiance, and then, old enemy, to do the same to you." So picking up from some of the dialogue at on the final page of the previous issue. The creative team here, Chris Claremont and Fabian Nicieza, writers, and that does speak to the fact that Claremont quit scripting the work halfway through. And also special thanks to Jim Lee for plot assist. So one of the reasons that Claremont left the book was because of a creative difference between him and the editor, Bob Harris, and the superstar penciler, Jim Lee. Jim Lee and Bob Harris were aligned in terms of what direction they wanted the X-Men to go. They wanted to hark back to their own favorite period of the book, which was the John Byrne, Chris Claremont era. They wanted to get the X-Men back to the school. They wanted characters like Colossus back on the team, and they wanted more action and adventure-based stories rather than the character-based stories that were the hallmark of Claremont's run, and in particular periods when he had great creative control, when Louise Simonson was his editor, and in particular when Ann Nocenti was the editor on the book. But times changed, and Claremont found with this storyline in particular, which brought a hurried end to his original vision to work up to a climactic final battle between the Shadow-King and Professor X for Uncanny X-Men number 300, to wrap it up quickly here in order to make way for a reconfiguration of the X-Men. The second book with the blue team, penciled by Jim Lee, and the Uncanny X-Men featuring the so-called gold team with Whilce Portacio producing the pencils on that. So Claremont just wasn't happy, and in particular his specific difficulty in this issue was undoing the happy ending he had given Colossus as an artist in Soho, with Callisto as his girlfriend, and that really broke his heart and led him to quit the book. So the rest of the creative team, Andy Kubert, guest penciler, Scott Williams, inker. Kubert does a really good job on this issue. It's easy to see that he knows that he is working on one of the top selling books in the industry. It's a showcase book for him, and he pulls out all the stops in terms of his artwork. And it turns out that Scott Williams is a very good combination with Kubert's art. They work very well together, and it seems that probably Scott Williams had some time off while Jim Lee was working on the design and pencils for the double-sized X-Men number 1. So there seems to be a team of letterers involved in this issue, Team Appendix, but I think that the first few pages are Tom Orzechowski, and Glynis Oliver is a colorist throughout. So let's continue with the story. The first half of the book focuses on Colossus and Professor X's attempt to pacify Colossus, and then ultimately the decision he has to make, which we'll get to shortly. So really what happens here, there's quite a lot of action. Colossus is pursuing Professor X and Stevie Hunter. Professor X uses his telepathy to stop Colossus in his tracks, but that gives the Shadow King an opening to attack him. As the Shadow King says here, silly Charlie, splitting your focus like that. Did you think I wouldn't notice or take advantage? And then Colossus here, this is a pretty cool panel, rips the very earth off the ground in order to trip up Stevie. And then she picks up Professor X and they both run for it as Colossus comes menacingly after them. Professor X finds a hatch which will give them access to the underground complex beneath the ruins of the X-Mansion, and they just manage to get inside as Colossus lands on top of the hatch. But it doesn't prove much protection for them, as Colossus simply punches through the hatch and pursues them down the corridors of the underground complex. There's an interesting little moment here where Professor X notes that the automatic defense systems have been deactivated. All of the yellow captions here are Professor X's first-person thoughts. So he thinks here, after such a violent forced entry, the interior defenses should have activated automatically. A glance at a remote status display reveals that they have been substantially disengaged. A puzzle for another day. In the meanwhile, I manually unleashed the intruder interdiction systemry. So who was responsible for substantially disengaging the defense systems of the underground complex? Not known. So Colossus is stalled somewhat, and then Professor X and Stevie make their way to the danger room, because Professor X plans to use the danger room to subdue Colossus. Just watch the page there. And then we get a scene set on the astral plane, recalling Uncanny X-Men 117, which featured an encounter between Amal Farouk, who was the avatar of the Shadow King at that time, and Professor X himself in Cairo, Egypt. And entering into this astral scene of the original conflict between them, where Professor X won by killing Amal Farouk telepathically, Colossus now enters the scene and starts attacking Professor X. But the danger room grabs Colossus, and this gives Professor X some time to think how he might subdue Colossus. He thinks to himself here, the danger room is designed to test the capabilities of my students to their absolute limits. In Colossus's case, I push him far beyond, trying desperately to find a weakness, a means to disable or restrain him without doing him more than superficial harm. The Shadow King is my true enemy. He's the one I should be fighting, but I dare not turn my attention to him until Colossus is dealt with. The lad is simply too dangerous. Now it's interesting here, there's a little bit of disjunction between the art and what Claremont chooses to put on the page in terms of text, because obviously this panel here is focused on Stevie Hunter, but we don't have any speech from her. So Claremont is doing his own thing here against the art by Kubert. And then Colossus gets free of the danger room's restraints, and Professor X thinks, I trained him too well. Under any other circumstances I would be proud, but Colossus is after them in a murderous rage while possessed by the Shadow King. Hi Stevie, he says, and bye Stevie, as he grabs her by the neck. So Professor X has to leap into action, the moment of truth, he thinks. The slightest misjudgment and Peter can break our bones like the driest, most fragile of twigs. As I anticipated, he drops Stevie, the better to get at me. But before he can, I plunge deep inside his mind. So Professor X using his telepathy here. A blazing, burning, blinding lance into a world brimful of miasmic shadows. I hear a howl of rage without knowing if it's Peter's cry or the Shadow King's or mine or all of us. So a dramatic moment of tension here. And then over the page, we get to the climax. The king resists, and on some levels, to my amazement, so does Peter himself. I find myself immersed in a whole new life, that of an artist named Peter Nicholas. So this goes back to Colossus emerging the other side of the Siege Perilous in Soho, Manhattan, and the new identity he develops for himself while amnesiac concerning his former identity as an X-Man. And he becomes an artist, and he becomes fascinated with and falls in love with Callisto. And basically they are living happily ever after at the end of Uncanny X-Men 264. And now this all has to be undone. It is as though the boy had been reborn without the slightest awareness of his true self or past. And in the process being granted his heart's desire, the ability to express his inner vision through art. I find a man who was happy, who had found a measure of inner and outer peace. That is, until the Shadow King claimed him. Though it breaks my own heart, I know what I must do. For beneath the world of Peter Nicholas lies that of Peter Rasputin. Locked tight away, I shatter those locks, tear down the walls, bring Colossus once more to a full awareness of who and what he is, in the process banishing all hold the Shadow King has on him. The shock is more than anybody should have to endure, or I think bitterly have to inflict. And this is on the nose. This seems to speak to Claremont's own feelings about having to script this plot, the decision made by Harris and Lee to bring Colossus back to the X-Men. The bitterness is Claremont's own here, it seems. As at last, mercifully, my student falls unconscious. And then we switch to Washington, D.C., where Jacob Rees, who's possessed by the Shadow King, and Dr. Lian Shen dialogue with each other about the Shadow King's plans. And this is Claremont's last scripted panel from his original 16-year run. It's the Shadow King speaking. I draw sustenance from the shadows and human souls. The stronger I grow, the wider my influence spreads, until the whole world is plunged into darkness, asks Lian. My dear Lian, he responds, how limited, how finite, how human your outlook. Why settle for just the earth when I can claim the stars? So on that point of the Shadow King's ultimate and infinite desire for possession of everyone and everything, Claremont decides to quit. He has no desire to script the following scene set on Muir Isle because, as I said, he felt at the time that he wasn't in control of the story. Claremont was a writer for whom the X-Men were real people, and his stories developed on the basis primarily of what he imagined those people would or wouldn't do. So for him, Lee and Harris's plot-based conception of the X-Men just wasn't anything he wanted to be party to. And so he downed tools and quit. But let's continue with what Fabian Nicieza scripted in the conclusion of this issue. And it's Jim Lee's plot that we're following here. So on Muir Isle, we have our trio of Wolverine, Jubilee, and Gambit in the X-Men uniforms. And there's some conflict erupting here between them, in particular between Jubilee and Gambit. And some of this has to do with the Shadow King's influence on the island, which is setting off everybody's level of aggression. And so they're arguing with each other and falling out. And here we can see that Gambit knocks Jubilee out with his staff. And Wolverine intervenes with his claws and Jubilee runs away. And then we have this scene where Gambit accuses Wolverine of cowardice and throws his telekinetically charged cards at him, which Nicieza thinks are psyche-charged knives in Wolverine's dialogue, and basically the pair split up. So Claremont didn't want to script any of this, and then we get a scene with Wolverine being attacked from behind by Forge, and of course we wonder at this point whether Forge has been possessed by the Shadow-King or not, but it turns out that he hasn't, and that he has, using his own mutant power to invent all kinds of gadgetry, whipped up a neurosynaptic buffer which will block out the Shadow-King's telepathic wavelengths. And so this now is going to keep Wolverine free of the Shadow-King's influence. And just a note here on the art. So Kubert is doing a great job on the art here, but something that he gets wrong here is Wolverine's size. This is not a 5'4" Wolverine, and that was something that was lost over time. Something that you see the likes of Silvestri and Byrne and also in particular, I'm just blanking on the, Art Adams really get Wolverine's proper size and dimensions when they draw him. This is way off here in this particular anchor image. And then we have Rogue's arrival, and Rogue, as we saw in the previous issue, has had her dark side released by the Shadow-King. She's embraced that, so Forge is unable to reason with her, and so he blasts her with his giant gun. And we really are into the 90s at this point with this kind of imagery. And also look at the very, there's a lack of dialogue here, very different storytelling, very different dialoguing going on from Claremont's half of the book. And of course we don't know how much time Nicieza had to script this. He might have been in quite a rush to get these pages finished and off to the printer. And then what we have is a final scene where in the aftermath of Professor X returning Colossus to his memories from his time as an X-Men, they limp into Salem Center just in time to witness a raging crowd chase this poor black boy out of town, telling him to die, go home and go back to Africa. This is all down to the Shadow-King's malign influence. And Xavier castigates the crowd. Stay back, he says, look at yourselves, this is but a child. What kind of madness has come over you? But of course it's the Shadow-King who is whipping up this prejudice and bigotry in the crowd, and also shows Xavier a vision of his students incapacitated, lie dying at each other's hands. But this is false, because as we saw, Forge has actually freed Wolverine back on Muir Isle. So the Shadow-King boasts that the world is his. And then we get our final page where Professor X is determined to thwart the Shadow-King, and we have his speech here. The Shadow-King prides himself on being the antithesis of my dream, in many ways claiming responsibility for my very founding of the X-Men. That is to say, Professor X founded the X-Men in order to combat fear and hatred, prejudice. And so he says, then let us play the hand he deals us. It is time to find my first students. We need the help of X-Factor, the original X-Men, yes? So the story, the Muir Island Saga, will be continued in X-Factor number 69 and then concluded in Uncanny X-Men 280, but without Chris Claremont for the first time in 16 years. And there's no mention of Claremont's departure here in the letters page, so it must have truly been sudden. And of course the plan was for Claremont to finish scripting the Muir Island Saga and continue as scripter on 2 X-Men books in parallel, Jim Lee's Adjectiveless X-Men and Whilce Portacio's run on Uncanny. But all of that came to an end here suddenly, abruptly, with Claremont quitting midway through this issue. And I just want to read for you something he said a year later in an interview for the Comics Journal. with Kim Thompson, so the Comics Journal number 152 from August 1992. Thompson asked him about his quitting the X-Books, and Claremont said, "At some point, there comes a realization that you're fucked. You don't own it, you have no control over it once you're gone, and to a certain extent, especially these days, you have no control over it while you're there. You're wholly and completely at the mercy, so long as you stay within the system, of forces beyond your control, who function from an agenda that has nothing to do with you, to which you are only a marginal contributor, and in some circumstances an actual impediment. As a part and parcel to this is the realization that when you do go, it won't make a difference. No one, per se, will miss you." But I think many of us did miss Claremont when he left the X-Books. And if that was you, let us know in the comments below the video. So I do hope that you enjoyed this video, this very significant issue, number 279, when Claremont left and quit his 16-year run on the X-Books. If you did like the video, please do so. Please hit like. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel already, please subscribe to the channel so that you can stay tuned for more content like this.